All right. Welcome everyone to the first session of the Responsible Innovation series through DCube's Assembly Initiative. We are so excited to be starting this series and discussing more about what responsible innovation can look like across a variety of sectors and skill sets, and just how this wonderful community can contribute to impact in that area. So I just want to kick off by speaking a little bit about DCubed and what they're doing for anyone who's not as familiar. The Digital Data and Design Institute at Harvard is reinventing how organizations compete and thrive in a digital world. And we're seeking to educate a new generation of leaders, especially through the DCubed Assemblies Learning Network, whose programming is open to the general community. We're trying to encourage a community of practitioners, lifelong learners, everyone interested in the research and work of the Institute's labs. These gatherings aim to create a community of learners and practitioners across DCube's areas of focus who can engage with and shape the work of the Institute. So a very collaborative effort in trying to address some of these big challenges that we see the world facing on a day-to-day basis. Within that, the Responsible Innovation series that we're kicking off today is seeking to address this capacity for rapid innovation, which is at an all-time high. And we're wondering, how can we ensure novel solutions are creating positive societal impacts, as well as reducing potential harm to all stakeholders who might be affected by them. So this series is going to explore how to innovate responsibly, inclusively, equitably across a wide array of domains and skills, regardless of where you find yourself in your career and life right now. There are definitely ways to create impact within the space of responsible innovation for sure. So to kick off our series, we've invited David to share his insights about building a responsible tech ecosystem. And I'm sure most of you saw his bio in the event description, but as a refresher, I want to let you know that David is the founder and director of All Tech is Human, a nonprofit committed to tackling wicked tech and society issues and co-creating a tech future aligned with the public interest. The NYC-based organization has been a springboard to underlying responsible tech movement through its summits, mixers, mentorship program, community Slack group, open working groups, and more that focus on multi-stakeholder convening and community building, multidisciplinary action, and diversifying the traditional tech pipeline with more backgrounds, disciplines, and perspectives. Their unique grassroots power model is designed to rapidly distribute power and ideas across a broad network so we can be better positioned to build a future aligned with our values. We're so excited to have David here. Before I hand off to him real quick, I just want to give a reminder of our community guidelines and go over how we'll be delivering today's session. So we ask that you are very respectful of moderators, speakers, and each other. And given that this is an inclusive knowledge sharing environment, we want to ensure that everyone feels comfortable asking questions and sharing their thoughts and being a part of this very intentional and important discussion that we're having here today. On the logistics side, we'll have everyone remain muted while David presents, and then we'll open up toward the end for questions. At that time, you can either raise your hand in Zoom using the reactions button on the bottom of your Zoom window. If you see that in your lineup of buttons there, you can go ahead and give me a thumbs up there if you hear that instruction and you know where that is. That's a great way to start interacting with it for the time being. That's where you'll be able to raise your question, and we'll call on folks to ask questions out loud. We also encourage you to absolutely engage in the chat as the presentation is going. Drop your questions in there. We'll start to collate them, and I'll relay some consolidated similar ideas that I see in that chat to David at the end during the Q&A as well. All right, so with all that in mind, I think we're all set to hand it over to David to kick things off.
Well, thank you, Kelsey. Really appreciate the invitation to kind of kick off this responsible innovation series. And I also noticed, kind of looking at my video, that I have a lot of whiteboards in my office. So a lot of what we're going to be discussing today around how the nonprofit that I started in 2018 here in New York, that has a global audience and global perspective, really just generates so many ideas, so many perspectives and resources. So a lot of what we're discussing over the next 25 minutes is just really this move away from a singular kind of sage on the stage vision, right? Where you have one person's ideas that they're trying to TEDify, if you will, and have that idea disseminate to the masses, Whereas the model that I've always kind of leaned into, which I think is a paradigm shift that's happening right now, is that we're moving away from the sage on the stage, and then we're going to this collective understanding and collective action. Because if we think about our tech future and aligning with the public interest, we need to underline the public interest part to say that behooves us to have public participation of a broad group of people. And oftentimes what I've seen in my own life, and the reason why I do what I do and why I wake up in the morning and drink a bunch of coffee and work hard on these issues, is that there's a lot of people who feel like their ideas are not translating and having a pathway into the levers of power. So a lot of what you're going to see in these slides that I'm going to bring up just in a minute is how can we create a new model, what we call a grassroots power model, that really tries to get inside of these insulated spaces, because these insulated spaces are oftentimes these levers of power. But what I've found through All Tech is Human is that the actual good ideas and the value that we need and the participation that we need is locked away in the grassroots type of model, right? So you effectively have good ideas over here and power structure over here, and they don't typically mix. So a lot of what we're discussing today is how All Tech is Human is building and strengthening this nascent responsible tech ecosystem so we can tackle these wicked tech and society issues and co-create a tech future aligned with public interest. Really how it is translating and creating pathways for all of these people and ideas to find their way into these different levers of power. And inside that system, it starts moving towards positive change. And we have change that happens from the inside of large tech companies, from the outside, providing oversight and really just research around its impact on different individuals. And then also reimagining our tech futures. So without further ado, I'm just going to share my screen and bring up my slides. Okay, so what we're talking about here today, you see our logo. Here we are, All Tech is Human, building the responsible tech ecosystem. You might say, if you've had no familiarity with All Tech is Human, well, that's kind of an unusual name, doesn't put center or institute right in it. What does the name mean? One of the reasons why I named it All Tech is Human is that I started seeing this real division of individuals. You have one camp, which is more the techno-solutionist type of camp, the people who think that tech is going to solve our social problems. And then you have another camp that's saying, well, technology is a tool that's designed by us, and therefore it should work with us. In addition, if it is impacting our human condition and the future of democracy, that is a big deal, full stop. And we need to have access to designing, developing, and deploying these technologies and having some input, really seeing that technology is intertwined with democracy. Therefore, it's our kind of civic engagement to participate in this tech future. So it's not just technologists who are deciding our tech future, it should be us as the general public across different backgrounds, disciplines, sectors, and perspectives. And that does not typically happen. And that's what a lot of the discussion today is going to be around. So one of the things that we look at when we talk about responsible tech, we're utilizing this as an umbrella term, really around reducing some of the online harms. We also want to underline the fact, and I think this is an important part, that this is a global, multidisciplinary, and multi-stakeholder type of approach. And I can't tell you how many times, because we have a large Slack group, 5,000 members across 61 countries, can't tell you how many times I get slacked every day where somebody says, wait a minute, I just read, we had an event last night with Meredith Broussard, her new book, More Than Glitch. So a lot of times somebody reads one of these key books, these key leaders like a Kathy O'Neill, Ruha Benjamin, and they get excited, or they watch a movie like Code of Bias that's on Netflix, and they say, well, I want to participate in this space. I want to participate in this movement. But how? And not only the how, but more importantly, potentially, am I welcome? That is the part that I have to say that individuals, oftentimes in positions of power, insulated spaces, if you will, don't necessarily see. One of the strengths of All Tech is Human is that we're able to see people's pain points because we're constantly surrounded by their proverbial pain, right? In other words, we have created a hyper-connected system that has thousands of inputs through mixers, summits, open working groups, live streams, Slack group. And it allows us to always be in the mix of perspectives that are totally different than mine. And that's a good thing. And I also need to say, and the reason why I mention it now, is that is something that I found when I started All Tech is Human in 2018, doesn't typically happen. A lot of our growth as an organization is because it wasn't necessarily being done by other groups, because it was kind of a invisible problem if you're not surrounded by the individuals who are knocking on your door to say, I want in. I'm a student. How do I get an education that's going to bring me into this responsible tech space? I'm a public interest technologist, or I care about responsible AI. I want to get into trust and safety. I care about tech and democracy. I care about youth, tech, and well-being. Is there a space for me? And oftentimes the language that we use, or the language that's oftentimes the traditional media narrative, usually frames it around a technologist and a reformer, right? And which side are you on? That is a dramatically off-base characterization that we're trying to change here at All Tech is Human, because this is an issue where we need the saints and the poets and the artists and designers and the attorneys and the advocates and psychologists. Everybody should be involved, especially areas that we're deeply involved in, such as improving social media. Social media, of course, is not just a quote unquote tech issue. We're dealing with human behavior. We're dealing with environmental cues. We're dealing with human-centered design, right? That's a big deal. And that's something that's very complex, similar to something like crime. So I'm giving this discussion, or having this discussion, where I'm sitting in New York, in Manhattan specifically. And I always think about the issue of crime in New York that has dramatically gone up and down over the years, right? And it's still at a historical low when you compare it to the 70s, 80s, and early 90s in New York, dramatically lower. But the population hasn't changed, and the human condition, you would think, hasn't changed dramatically. So what has altered, right? When you talk about crime, we think of needing to think about design, right? Law enforcement, mental health. Likewise, when we're thinking about these tech issues, they're actually tech in society, or social technical in nature. And where we're at right now with All Tech is Human is trying to embed this system with a complex level of thinkers that are interconnected. In other words, this problem is not going to be solved by somebody just like me. I'm part of the puzzle, right? I'm one spoke in the responsible tech wheel, and that everything that I'm trying to do as an individual in this space is to move it towards the need of collective action, because these issues are so complex that one individual is not the alpha and the omega, right? They are not able to holistically understand or have these lived experiences to understand the different impacts. We need to move it away from this one person being able to solve it, or whose responsibility is it, to realizing that this is a complex societal issue that is intertwined with the future of democracy and human condition, and that it behooves us to deal with it respectfully and also creatively with a strong ecosystem, strong and robust ecosystem. So that's what we're talking about there. I can switch over just a little bit of background, just to say, why am I speaking? Why am I here today? I have a background as an attorney and educator. I mention that because a lot of people attracted to the space do not have a traditional tech career. One of the learnings that we had just building All Tech is Human is we've done hundreds of interviews now since 2018. We've had over 500 people interviewed specifically around their career path. What is their motivation? What's the skill set that thrives? And one of the commonalities we noticed is that people who are in this responsible tech ecosystem, they oftentimes think they're a unique unicorn because they say, well, David, I have a nonlinear career path, right? I spent some time at the White House, and then I went over here, and I traveled overseas, and then a startup reached out, and that caused me to go to a large tech company, and then I got disillusioned, and then I went over here, right? So they have a very interesting career that they think is unique. But one of the things that we actually find is that this kind of amalgamation of all of these different perspectives across sectors and disciplines is actually a commonality that feels unique because it's different than the traditional media narrative. In other words, in order to kind of build this system, we need to have this kind of transdisciplinary type of thinking. And I will mention one of the frustrations we've had. We deal a lot with college students, master's and PhD and law students. And the frustration is, how do we kind of upskill individuals to deal with the complexity of misinformation and hate speech and everything that's going on with ChatGPT and OpenAI right now? These are hard issues, and they're not solved by one discipline alone. So how do we increase the exposure on all different parts of that? And that's why we have a mentorship program in the Slack group where people connect, and then in-person engagements. We recently just started a engagement series in New York, where every month we're going to be holding a gathering for 200 people. And then we're also setting up ones in DC, San Francisco, doing our first one in London coming up, and then also for a lot of online types of engagements. Here's just a picture to kind of show you the kind of robust nature. This was a mixer that we held November 30th in the Lower East Side of New York. And it just shows that this is not something where somebody is alone. I say that because one of the kind of North Stars that we've always had with All Tech is Human, a line that's in the book by renowned media theorist Douglas Rushkoff and his book, Team Human, where it said, how do we find the others? That's something that I want to really emphasize here, because it was a major, major pain point. Starting in 2018, we held our first Ethical Tech Summit, that we called it at the time, in October 2018 in New York. Notice we were onto something right away. People flew in across the country, a bunch from Europe and elsewhere. And one of the struggles was that oftentimes people say, is it just you and me who care about these issues? Are we alone? And one of the things that we do is we try to curate the hundreds of organizations that are doing this. So right now we have a list of over 500 responsible tech organizations. And by interviewing 500 people and by having reports, we released 4 reports last year, all done with open working groups, more like a Wikipedia type of style. What we find with that is that rapidly accelerates the responsible tech movement because it puts everybody on the 90-yard line, right? It gives people the resources that would take somebody like you or me years, right? I've been in this space now for over a decade. I've spent countless time with coffee meetings, with Zoom calls, with speaking. A lot can really be cultivated together to show the robust ecosystem. And one of the things that we found, one of the reasons for All Tech is Human, was that most organizations in the space, their mandate is usually singular around kind of who they are as a brand, if you will. Whereas our mandate and our mission is around being that connective tissue for the responsible tech movement and strengthening the overall ecosystem. Therefore, we kind of act as this agnostic Switzerland, if you will, across people, organizations, and ideas of this nascent space, which lifts all boats and accelerates the entire movement. It also leads to some great ways to move this along. So I'm going to show, these are just some pictures, but here's an example I wanted to bring up. And then I also want to talk about the speed at which we can move, the speed of tech. Because one of the things that we're noticing is that we have 21st century problems, but oftentimes 20th century mindsets and tools that we're applying. And this isn't just in the responsible tech space. I think we've noticed, if you're viewing this from the United States, that we have political stagnation, even with issues like Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act in 1996, the most consequential law dealing with social media. What we've seen with the recent Supreme Court cases is they're probably going to kick it over to the legislative branch, and the legislative branch is probably not going to do much with it. So you have frustration from the general public who is saying social media is having a deep impact on our society. What do we do about it? And there's a disconnect that's happening right now with how fast innovation is moving and how slow consideration is moving. You could also argue that because our consideration has stayed relatively stagnant, but it's accelerated in terms of its innovation, the delta or gulf between the two has grown larger, which is why we're frustrated. So you have topics like facial recognition that get released into the wild, and then you have the public that says, wait a minute, we haven't determined its social impacts yet. Therefore, it seems inappropriate for it to have these major effects on society and its ability sometimes to perpetuate and accelerate discrimination and inequities. That's a major deal. It's not a tech issue. It's an issue of fairness and equality. It's an issue of democracy. That's what we're talking about here. So one of the things I like to point out is this happened on March 1st. Here we have a quick event that we planned just in 6 days with eSafety Commissioner Julie Ann Grant from Australia, who's done some pioneering work in the field of safety by design. So a little gathering that we had, an intimate discussion around reducing harms on March 9th. And then even from last night, quickly updated these slides. This is a picture from last night with the Responsible Tech Mixer and book launch for Meredith Broussard's new book, More Than a Glitch. Meredith is also the author of Artificial Unintelligence that came out just a few years ago. I mentioned this because those are 3 events that happened in the last 15 days. And then on February 28th, we released our Tech and Democracy report that had 40 profile interviews. The reason why I mentioned that is because the great frustration that is happening right now is tech is moving quickly, but society and our ability to understand and react and to be proactive around these is still getting outpaced because it's moving too slowly. And the argument that I would make is that it's because we don't have correct models around how we engage with this. Our political system even is, I think, inadequate for getting ahead of the curve on issues like ChatGPT and GPT-4 now. That's why we need a new system. So what we have underneath the surface is this robust and growing responsible tech movement that is transdisciplinary, all different sectors, people across the globe, different perspectives coming together. And a lot of where this needs to go is how do we take that knowledge base, right? And how do we connect it with all the different levers of power to rapidly accelerate tech consideration to lower the delta between innovation and consideration. So that's what we do here. Another major part is not just on this community building, but also education and diversifying this traditional tech pipeline. A major part, right? In order to build a better tech future, how can we have better individuals involved in the system? I would argue that it's easier to upskill an individual than it is to change their personality. That's really important because you have a lot of people who are now entering the space or aspirationally want to get involved in the space, but they feel inadequate in the sense of their skill set for being in this kind of technical, oftentimes technical space. So where this is going, and a lot of the work that we're trying to do at All Tech is Human, is how do we upskill that individual? Because I would argue it's more important than trying to get a traditional technologist to just care more. In other words, you can think about this as two different sides of coin. Oftentimes, and I would say the bulk of the last 10 years has focused on how do you get somebody with a traditional CS degree from Stanford, who's at Google right now, how do you get them to be more ethical? So that's A, right? We're focused on B, which is saying, how do you get the person who is naturally aligned with the public interest, who cares about the social impacts, who is values aligned with this overall movement? How do you get that person to upskill on the technical side and be part of the fabric of the quote unquote tech industry? Because it's a lowercase t now, right? It's not just people with a CS degree. All different backgrounds are involved in the space and should get more involved in this space. So that's where I mentioned, I can skip that over, right? We have a misalignment around 20th century tools and mindsets and 21st century problems. I don't think that we have adjusted to that. A lot of what we're trying to do is create this heavily participatory type of model and move at the speed of tech. And then the other part to underline is that we need to move away from a singular vision, and I've got a slide coming up with the sage on the stage, right, to collective understanding and action. So the reason why we had that event last night, it's not just to say, wow, I want to have good appetizers, right? I want to see a person on stage. That's nice, but the real value is turning to your right and turning to your left and looking behind you and looking in front of you and realizing that there's other people who deeply care about where the future is going and oftentimes are altering their career, are moving into new jobs, are totally upending their life because they deeply care about the future of democracy, the future of the human condition, and they realize that it's directly connected with how we design, develop, and deploy technologies. And that's the space that we're trying to create and then always expand. So this is what I would argue is kind of an outdated model, this TEDification of life. As much as I like a good TED Talk and TED Radio Hour, that's not going to solve the issue. I think there's a little bit of a divide right now. I can't tell you how many times I go to a gathering where there's somebody on stage who says, God, if only in the future we had a movement, if we had all these people, thousands of people who cared, and that's what we need. But oftentimes in life, I will say there's a division between the person who is on a speaking circuit and the person who is working in the weeds and feels kind of the pain of others and understands who needs to get involved. So right now, there's actually a groundswell of support. We've noticed this because we're directly dealing with it with All Tech is Human. We're just trying to keep up with the demand. There's just so much interest. However, what we need to do is flip the script to showcase that we have the ideas, that the ideas, the talent, the passion is there, and how does that start shifting over? So again, we don't just need a paradigm, or sorry, we don't just need a tech shift, we need a paradigm shift. So instead of saying, here are my ideas, how do we create a participatory system to say, what are your ideas? And create a situation, and this is the hard part of threading a needle. You want to make sure that it's not chaotic in terms of how we gather different ideas. So really just creating a scenario where you can constantly have feedback, constantly understand different perspectives, tie together community, illuminate who are the sources of traditional power, who are individuals that can offer mentorship, really just doing a lot of ecosystem mapping that then accelerates every other new entrant into this overall movement. We start noticing that there's a lot of really kind of personal needs of why people are in this space. What do they care about? They want to learn, they want to meet other people, they want to find the others, they want to find meaningful work. Just quickly, as I quickly mentioned, the key topics that you're going to see in responsible tech are these kind of underlying areas of responsible AI, trust and safety, public interest technology, tech and democracy, and youth tech and well-being, right? Huge part that we try to do is not only accept different backgrounds, but that needs to be part of the dialogue. That needs to actually be pushed out there. And this is starting to happen. If you look at an example like the former kind of Mozilla Foundation's CS challenge, it's now, it went from a responsible computer science challenge to a responsible computing challenge, recognizing that this is not just for one type of thinker, that it's a complex issue or issues that we're dealing with. Therefore, it needs a broad group of different thinkers that are kind of interconnected in more of a collective type of action. Mention that, quickly kind of move that over. Lastly, I know we have a lot of slides, so these are also going to be shared with anyone, and they're also on our website, alltechishuman.org, just laying out kind of these key principles that we have at All Tech is Human, recognizing that it's not just for technologists, that we need all different backgrounds, no application without representation, not about us without us, right? That we are part of the process. That's the different part, right? Between All Tech is Human and oftentimes a lot of other organizations is most are structured in a traditional kind of top-down approach of saying, how do we get a couple recognized leaders that you respect and that you care about? What's their kind of wisdom? And then how do we package that up and then disseminate that to you as the reader? And how do you as the reader run with that to your community? And I would argue, and one of the things we're doing differently is that we're trying to say that's outdated. That's not what individuals want, because then they would feel like their tech future is placed upon them as opposed to co-created with them. So how do we give individuals environments and tools to be actively part of this overall process? Seeing the time, I'm going to start kind of moving towards the end. So one of the things I wanted to mention is that we oftentimes, and again, this is on our website, we need to actively discuss ways to get involved, not just ways to be a fan of something, right? So All Tech is Human and the work that we do around building and strengthening the responsible tech movement and ecosystem, it's not about just, wow, here's this cool idea, let me run with it. It's about saying this is a collaborative effort, right? Instead of like a pack of wolves that get led, how do we become a flock of birds that can determine a direction to fly in, right? That would be the major kind of difference. But again, you can see all this on the website. So I'm just going to kind of switch speeds a little bit towards the end. The main part is we're really about trying to listen, not just speak. So as much as I like kind of traveling around and speaking with individuals across the globe, it's really about getting those individuals who we interact with to be part of the fabric of the overall ecosystem, because that's going to be more important, because I'm one person. You listening are one person. We have our proverbial kind of spots that we're never going to see because we have different experiences, that we grow up in a certain area. How do we create this in a more global, multidisciplinary, multi-sector approach with different perspectives? One of the things that you'll find really that we're trying to do to accelerate this overall ecosystem is also create resources, but then the resource is not just about that end product, but also about the process. So just our open working groups, that's dramatically different too, because if you're talking about elite organizations, well, it's really hard to get on their working group. So one of the struggles, one of the pain points that so many people have had approaching All Tech is Human is they said, I want to get involved in this space, but in order to beef up my CV, I need to get experience. So they're caught in that kind of catch-22. All Tech is Human is designed to have volunteer opportunities, to have opportunities where you can join a working group. And then oftentimes that leading to speaking at one of our events or being involved in a live stream, and that leading to a deeper community, which then leads to an internship or fellowship, a job offer. This happens dozens and dozens of times where people are struggling to get involved, but because they can now get into a system, it then accelerates their learning and it builds their community and it grows their exposure, which then leads to new voices being heard in this overall movement and space. I talked about the grassroots power model. I just want to emphasize, we need to take parts of both the grassroots where the ideas are held and traditional power structures that oftentimes are holding these levers of power and then can move that along. We've done that intentionally by creating an agnostic space that attracts people across civil society, government, industry, academia. I always get asked, well, who shows up at your gatherings? Well, it's a very interesting mix because you have people from large tech companies and people who, are against large tech companies sitting in the same room. And then you have students and you have artists and you have researchers. You have people who are pivoting into the space, people who are veterans in the space, people who are with large kind of elite organizations. And one of the things that you find is they disagree at the surface, but at a sub-level, there's agreement and they're flowing in the same direction because they agree of a commonality that the current path we're on is not sustainable, that in order to build a better tech future, we need to have a more participatory model. We need to learn from each other. We need to understand our values, our differences, our commonalities, and how do we then create a path that's going to be better for our civil liberties, for our overall kind of future that we want to see and also have for future generations. Would say I'm just going to kind of move towards the end so we can get into the kind of question portion. Love to kind of have some dialogue. Just want to emphasize that we don't just need a tech shift, right? We need this paradigm shift. The current approach is, I would argue, outdated. Oftentimes, people in positions of power are not having access to the ideas that they need to build a tech future that works for more people. But the ideas are there because there is a robust, passionate, global, multidisciplinary ecosystem that wants to get involved. But oftentimes, they feel like the decisions are being made at this proverbial dinner table, but they don't have a seat at the dinner table. So what we're doing at All Tech is Human is we are building a larger dinner table, and we're inviting everyone to that dinner table. And yes, it gets a little messy, but it's also about our future of the human condition and democracy. It should get a little messy. We should be able to have different values and disagreement, because what we try to do then is find areas of consensus and understanding and co-creation. So this is the last slide that I'll leave you on. If you want to kind of stay in touch, join our Slack. It's all an open, free kind of community. Drop me a line at david@alltechishuman.org, or if you're ever in the New York area, we have a lot of gatherings. Like I mentioned, the monthly gatherings for 200 people at BetaWorks in Manhattan. So do stay in touch. I'm just going to stop sharing, but again, really appreciate the privilege of being able to share the story with building this responsible tech ecosystem with All Tech is Human. All right, Kelsey, I'll just flip it over to you to see if we have any comments or questions so we can kind of continue this dialogue.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. That's great. Let's see, we've already got one kind of dropping into the chat here. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on globalizing the movement. I assume your work is currently focused largely on big US tech companies, as they're the biggest players in the tech industry. What can I, as a member of the general public, do here in Europe and my own country to upskill myself and understand policy?
Good. Well, one of the things that we're noticing, one of the reasons why we're doing a lot now in the UK and Europe is we're trying to have this kind of transatlantic dialogue, because if you really kind of think about it, oftentimes the tech and power structure is being created and sometimes put upon from the United States. But then usually from Europe and the UK, you have a more proactive and innovative tech policy type of areas. So even when we think around a lot of European countries like France and Germany, there are considerations around the right to be forgotten, or in France, the right to disconnect, or a lot of the work being done around online safety in Europe and the UK. That is now influencing American debate and discussion. So from the European perspective, one of the things that we could always do, and for anybody kind of listening, is find ways of partnering up with this dialogue so we can kind of connect the overall ecosystem, right? So wherever you might be in Europe, finding different kind of hubs of activity and then connecting with our organization that then is sitting on a mountain of resources. So one of the things that we're trying to decide from All Tech is Humans perspective is how much do we want to scale? One of the things that we are always considerate of is making sure that movements are led directly, that it's not kind of astroturfed, if you will. So we're very mindful about going into areas where we wouldn't have the natural understanding of, but instead would want to partner with those individuals. So we're constantly talking to groups out of, Berlin or Amsterdam or Paris and London, a lot of activity that's happening in the space, and then sending over resources to say, well, here's what we're doing. Here's what we just did with our responsible tech mixer. Maybe that's something you would like to kind of remix or find an idea. So it's kind of like the Creative Commons versus copyright. A lot of people in this space, we should be kind of borrowing ideas in the sense of recognizing what is happening in the space and how we can learn from each other. So I'm constantly kind of scouring news and talking to a lot of people to say, wow, did you see what just happened in Denmark? Maybe that's something that could happen in New York. Maybe that's interesting, because I think one of the struggles is technology, especially social media and AI, are global consequences, yet we're still dealing with them in a country by country basis, but tech knows no boundaries. So how do we, as the kind of original idea of the web of a global village, how do we come together to promote knowledge sharing and collaboration? So I would advocate for anybody who wants to get involved, no matter where they are, to kind of reach out with our organization to see how we can kind of continue to build roots and build each other up.
See a raised hand. I'm going to ask one question that I see in the chat first, and then Caitlin will get to you. And I saw that you posted as well in the chat. But I would love to address, just because David and I were having an interesting chat about this a couple weeks ago. How are we convincing the folks who have the current, more traditional power, these big tech companies, and policymakers as well, the folks who need to be focusing on sort of tech ethics a lot more? How do we convince them that's a worthwhile pursuit? Because as much as we're kind of building this grassroots energy and pushing for change, it's important to have them be part of that conversation and convince them it's a worthwhile conversation to have.
Well, and this is where a lot of times people bring up Ralph Nader's movement, Unsafe at Any Speed, which rapidly kind of accelerated automobile safety in the 60s. And that's a useful analogy and story, because oftentimes people point out that the automobile industry didn't change even after confronted with needless deaths from not wearing seatbelts. So it was obvious to the public that seatbelts would save lives, but because of the small financial cost that it would be to put into vehicles, it didn't change. So I mentioned that because a lot of times it is going to be pressure from the inside, pressure from the outside, and then also reimagining tech futures that would allow us to be creative, because sometimes we have this kind of lock-in about what is possible. Get asked this question a lot at All Tech is Human, and so I always say, well, AI ethics, tech ethics are great, but that needs to really be a leading force into also changing kind of the kind of legality situation. So, for example, in the United States, we have a lot of problems around our data. So it'd be a lot easier kind of having a national, data privacy law than it would always trying to get a individual to do the right thing, because oftentimes that butts up against the realities of capitalism, right? And kind of like a Friedman type of respect of maximizing profits within the confines of legality. So there's all those different parts. So one of the analogies we oftentimes use is that this is a Rubik's Cube issue. And one of the other kind of key stakeholders I would mention too, that are definitely coming up a lot more at All Things Human, is how do you influence the founders, but also the funders? Because I distinctly remember one time in 2018 being on stage where I had this founder and there's a Q&A portion said, I want to do the right thing, but I will then not get funding because my funders are saying that's where the money is, right? So even though you have a person who wants to do the right thing, they have the cold hard reality, since this is now not just a theoretical issue. So effectively what you need to do is find all these different parts, these levers of change to say, well, we need to put more pressure on funders. We need to change the laws. We need to embed kind of more ethical questioning in the overall system. We need to have better education throughout. We need to have a more global approach. So again, it goes back to a Rubik's Cube scenario that every part is interconnected and affecting one another. And that's really going to be, I think, the major shift.
Caitlin, do you want to come in with your question?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what David was saying about how wonderful All Tech is Human is.
Thank you.
The event in November, I've been to a lot of their different mixers, and actually was at the event for Meredith Broussard last night, and I've met so many interesting friends that I've seen so much over the past 6 months, connected with business colleagues, lots of differing viewpoints, all kind of centered around that nucleus that David was saying around, making tech more human, humane, ethical, things of that sort. And just wanted to say that however people can get involved, it really is a wonderful organization. And thanks so much, David, for presenting and doing the work that you're doing.
That's really kind of you to say. And honestly, that's what kind of like keeps me going, because I will say, like, the disconnect oftentimes is people in kind of these positions of power. There's like a disconnect with who's seeing the problem and who's not seeing. Yeah. So sometimes you have to get within the community to say, this is passionate. This is where the change is happening. It's not happening. Yeah.
Exactly. And I actually met someone, Meg McNulty, who's went to Stanford and does some tech ethics stuff. And we kind of have this like spin-off group now where she, we talk about feminism and technology, and my research on technology's affecting conversation, invited her, and then she invited people through her network to it. So it's just kind of that spreading of the, the sociologist in me loves the, looking at the different social networks and how they're connected. And that's the real wonderful part about this. So definitely would encourage everyone to get involved. And thanks again, David.
Oh, no, thank you. And that was really kind of you to kind of say, and that's what it's about. It's like so many new groups are spinning off because All Tech is Human is effectively acting as a magnet that connects people from all different backgrounds who are passionate about this issue, and then say, oh, okay, well, what can we do together? So it's supposed to be a stimulus, supposed to be a springboard. So that's awesome.
Exactly.
Very cool.
Fantastic. And I echo that sentiment, absolutely, that it's a very, very wonderful community, deeply fulfilling, regardless of where you are in terms of being a stakeholder within this space. There are tons of people in All Tech is Human to connect with.
It never ends. I mean, that's the thing. It's like because I think inspiration is something that we discount, but we're dealing with hard issues. I deal a lot with people in trust and safety, and they deal with the worst in humanity, but you deal with the worst in humanity because you actually are attracted and care about bringing out the best in humanity. So we need to really kind of recognize that and empathize that and humanize it in the sense that we're doing this for a real reason, because it aligns with our values. But Kelsey, just quickly, I did see a question pop up around funding. I can kind of quickly answer that. We are a 501c3 with our fiscal sponsor, Hopewell Fund. I know early on we're trying to decide what's the best model to grow this. One of the reasons that we do it through a traditional kind of foundation source of major funders like Ford Foundation, Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, Susan Crown Exchange, Schmidt Futures, and others, is because we wanted a very low barrier of entry. So even just the gathering last night, that's something that was free, right? It costs a couple of $1,000s for us to run. We do it for free. So then there's never a barrier of entry for somebody who says, I just saw coded bias. So maybe this is for me. And then they go there and then they meet 5 people. And then 2 of them say, hey, let's do coffee next week. And then one of them then leads to a collaboration. Like that's the magic that can happen. And it's not going to happen if we treat it from a different model. So there's no perfect, business model for a nonprofit. They all come with trade-offs, but I will say that's kind of working. And we're also seeing a potential part in our kind of career matchmaking kind of aspect as well.
Fantastic. I think a really good note to close out on. We'll have one more question and then we'll kind of close with some information and actions that you guys can take as you leave the session and go into future sessions or other networking. But I think a nice way to kind of round this out is talking about that building of robust community, incorporating all these varying perspectives. I've seen a couple questions surrounding how you take all these varying perspectives on the role of technology in society, right? And how you build those into sort of a cohesive path forward and a collective action while acknowledging constructive dissent and incorporating that and iterating your views over time. Do you have just closing thoughts on how those get translated into these collective actions?
A lot of what we try to focus on is that this is an iterative process, that it's a work in progress. And we oftentimes try to incorporate these various perspectives through our open working groups. So for example, I know when we were doing improving social media, we had over 200 people from all different backgrounds kind of come together. And then by putting that out to the kind of community. And then, but also, and here's the important part, is most structures are still done on a sense of, hey, we just put out this white paper, here's a report, like us, and then there's nothing to do with it. Read it and share it with your friends. As opposed to, here's a report, what are we missing? Who did we forget? Who should we include? What idea were we potentially wrong on? By having a sense of humility and that this is a complex topic, and we also have rapidly changing tech, and we have limitations from even just where we're based. So having the sense that this is a bi-directional communication. So for the fact that somebody can say, hey, did you think about this group? They're doing great work. They should be incorporated. So then we said, all right, perfect. We're doing another working group and another report. So the idea would be that we're constantly learning and then taking those learnings, synthesizing them, pushing that out to the community. And then the community is saying, here's other ways that it can improve. So by having, it's a little bit of a flywheel, by having a sense that everyone is part of the process and that everybody should be contributing to it because it's our tech future and that's intertwined with future democracy and community condition. So having that overall involvement, I think that's always the key part.
Absolutely agree. And also what we continue to hope to achieve through series like this, through All Tech is Human. On that note, I have just dropped some links in the chat. I highly, highly, highly encourage all of you to go to the All Tech is Human link tree. I guarantee there will be something that appeals to you in an intersection that is meaningful to the work you want to be doing in the responsible tech ecosystem. You'll meet a ton of fantastic people who are very passionate about similar things, and hopefully be exposed to new viewpoints in those areas as well. I've also dropped the link for future RI series events. You'll see more events popping up on that page as we pull them together, but we're going to be really digging into the nitty-gritty of some of these elements as we move forward. We're going to talk about product inclusion, how you can make inclusive and participatory design part of your product evolution and innovation. Possibly do some workshops to really give you some tangible skills to take away in that regard and making sure you're innovating responsibly. We're going to be talking a little bit more about funding structures and how that contributes to responsible innovation ecosystems. Lots of cool stuff coming up, and I'm so excited to dig into those a little bit more in future sessions, and just want to extend a very hearty thank you to all of you for coming and engaging in this discussion, and especially to David for sharing his insights with us.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate being here.
All right, thank you all so much. We'll be posting out more information, like I said, including you'll see recordings for the sessions come up in subsequent weeks. There's a little bit of a lag, so I do encourage you to come to the events themselves and participate in the discussion, but we'll put those other resources up as well, including the recordings. All right, thank you all so much for joining us and have a great day.
Thank you.